Hello and welcome. We're going to be talking about Samhain today, or the Witch's New Year, as we like to call it. But we're not just going to be talking about some practices or rituals or spells that you can do during this time of year, which we will talk about at the end of the video. But we're also going to be looking at the historical, mythological, and, dare I say, archaeological evidence for why this time of the year was actually the original and true New Year in the ancient Celtic past. If you're new here, hi, my name is Freya Serafina. I'm a PhD researcher in women's spirituality, and my dissertation is focused on using ritual as a means of cultural and spiritual reclamation using my own ancestral lineage. And I'm also a practicing hedge witch, and I'm the founder of a Women's Spirituality Institute. And yeah, there's a couple other things too, but those don't really matter right now. So, what is Samhain, and why do we call it the Witch's New Year? So Erin Mullally sums up the significance of Samhain very nicely in her article Samhain Revival for the journal called Archaeology. And she says that Samhain is a significant Celtic festival that marks a transition from the harvest season to the winter. It is traditionally celebrated on the night of October 31st, and it is believed to be when the boundary between the living and the spirit world is the thinnest. So during Samhain, the Celts would honor the dead and prepare for the winter months, as it is a time when livestock were slaughtered and plants began to die. The festival holds deep roots in ancient traditions, and many of its customs have influenced modern Halloween celebrations. So, for instance, the spooky elements associated with Halloween, such as ghosts and the dead returning to the living world, can be traced back to Samhain. The Celts would leave food or offerings outside of their homes to appease the spirits, and they also engage in activities like dressing in costume and reciting verses, which are all early forms of trick or treating. Samhain is also linked to various rituals and celebrations at sites like the Hill of Ward, where evidence of large-scale feasting and ritual activity has been found. The festival has been revived in modern times, demonstrating its lasting cultural significance. Helen Sewell Johnson gives us a bunch of reasons why Samhain, this ancient Celtic festival, still has and had so much historical and cultural significance. But she's looking at it through Irish life and literature as well. So she also tells us that this is celebrated on the night of October 31st, marking the transition from one year to the next in the Celtic calendar. So, some historical roots. The customs associated with Samhain predate Christianity in Ireland, and this festival is linked to various historical events and practices that were recorded in manuscripts, indicating that these traditions are much older than the written records themselves. We also know that this was a deeply religious time. You could say spiritual, you could say religious. These are maybe more modern terms for what was happening. But non-Christian worship, pagan worship, is documented during this time. So the pagan king named Tigern Mas, I'm sure I said that wrong, and his followers would gather to pay homage to the god Crom Craig, which I know I butchered. I'm so sorry. Demonstrating the festival's deep-rooted spiritual practices. And also, there were a lot of activities that happened during this time, like feasting, making legal decisions, engaging in battles, both cosmic battles and earthly battles. And it was a time when the harvest was completed and prophecies were sought for the upcoming year. And as we know, Samhain is seen as a time when the boundary between the human world and the supernatural world is thin, allowing for this communication and interaction between the two realms. So I think this is really apparent in this idea that prophecies were being sought, right? We have all of a sudden this untapped connection to our ancestors and the other world, the realms of the dead, the realms of the spirits, the realms of the gods, and we can divine what the harvest might be like. Should I go to battle? Should I buy this goat? Should I make this huge legal decision that I'm making? And I also find it interesting that we're thinking about battles, engaging in battle, and making legal decisions because we're coming to the end of one cycle and we're beginning a new year. And so it's like tying up loose ends or, making decisions for the year to come. And that's kind of interesting. Now, in terms of more myth and more landscape, we've got Ronald Hicks, who tells us that Samhain is a significant festival that's mentioned in documents that are associated with various henge enclosures and onak sites, or gathering places. So it is described as a time at the end of the harvest season, and we know that the Feast of Tara, for example, was held at Samhain, and there are different events that happened at Newgrange that are emphasized during this time. And we see this in the tale of Tach Mark Etain. I'm so sorry for any of my Celtic, rather Gaelic speakers. I know this isn't good. So, Tach Mark Etain means the wooing of Etain. It's an early text from the Irish mythological cycle, and it also features characters from the Ulster cycle and the cycle of kings. It is a partially preserved the story itself is partially preserved in the manuscript known as the Labor na Huidre, and completely preserved in the Yellow Book of Lecan. Sorry, everyone. I'm going to have all these names below and links as well. So it's written in a language believed to date to the 8th or 9th century, and it tells of the lives and loves of Etain, who was a beautiful mortal woman of the Ulaid, and her involvement with Angus and Medir of the Tuatha De Danann, which are the mythological race of beings that are said to be the direct ancestors of the Irish people. So it is frequently cited as a possible source text for the Middle English Sir Orfeo, and Harvard professor Geoffrey Gantz described the text as displaying the poetic sense of law in Irish legal society. So what I find really enjoyable and relevant to this tale taking place at Samhain is because this is a story of transformation. So Etain, she dies. Well, she's murdered. She dies. She is carried in the womb. She is birthed. And she lives to find her true love once again. And then she returns to the underworld. And so we're seeing these cycles of death, birth, life, and death again, and rebirth. And I'm going to touch on that in just a moment. I'm just laying the groundwork here. So Daniel Giarudon tells us something else that's kind of interesting. And he tells us that during this time, all souls would report to their former homes. So this suggests that during this period, the connection between the living and the deceased is particularly strong. I've said this a few times now. He also indicates that the souls of the dead are thought to return to the places where they used to live, especially on important occasions like Samhain, Yule, etc. So this belief surrounding Samhain reflects a broader cultural understanding of death and the afterlife in Celtic traditions, where the deceased are seen as maintaining a presence in the lives of their living relatives. This is really important, and I'm going to tell you why. So I actually talked about this cave, and it's called the Owain Nugget Cave, or the Cave of Cruachan, and it's considered the entrance to the other world, and it's in County Roscommon. Now, I spoke about this cave in an article that I published called Womb to Tomb, and it focused on the rituals and practices and the belief system of people in ancient Crete, but it touched on all these other parts of the world. And I demonstrated how most people in the ancient world were part of some kind of cult of the dead. And if I'm using the word cult and it's really scaring you, I want you to go to my videos and find an older video that I made about the original meaning of that word. I also want to say that the problem with our modern contemporary minds is that when we hear words like dead, death, tomb, it's very scary, generally speaking. I'm not talking about everyone. And while many of us have some kind of, religious ideology or framework that we believe in that tells us there's an afterlife or a rebirthing of some kind, we're very disconnected from practices in our daily life where we actually confront the cycle of death. Now, when we look at Samhain and all those things that I just read about it from scholars and people who have published about it, one thing is clear. This is a time of death and rebirth. And that's why it's considered the new year. We're dealing with a society, I'm specifically looking Northern Hemisphere, ancient Celts. I know the term Celt is problematic as an umbrella. That could be another video. It's not my area of expertise, but it can certainly be a video. I'm using it generally and broadly. This was an agricultural society. And when we're looking at agricultural societies, we're looking at people who are very in tune with the cycles of nature and the land. That is how they survive. And so spiritual, religious, philosophical, what have you, frameworks crop up to support what they are seeing in the landscape and experiencing. And we used to not be so disconnected from nature and other animals and the land and each other. And so we would feel these cycles more deeply in our bodies. And our ancestors had daily, weekly, monthly, bi-monthly, whatever, cyclical opportunity to confront the idea of death and rebirth. We don't really do that. And so what I found in my research is that caves in particular were thought to be portals to the other world because of their representation of the womb. There is archaeological evidence of ritual activity, offerings, fertility rites and rituals, death rites and rituals, burials that took place in caves. There really was no distinct separation between this idea of birth and death. It was all just part of the cycle for many ancient peoples. And something that's really significant there is this idea that we begin in the dark and we end in the dark. And that's what happens at Samhain. We begin in the dark. We have this 3-day sort of liminal space of nothingness where the veil is pulled back. Our ancestors are there. The spirits are there. And this is a time of conception. It's a time of thinking and dreaming and being in the watery, mysterious space before we tip into darkness, or rather submerge into darkness, into incubation, underground into the womb. Then we get to the winter solstice and things start to speed up. We start to move back toward the light. We're growing and growing and growing, and we get to Beltana, and there's an explosion of life. And then we get to Letha, or the summer solstice, and we are fully grown. And we tip back into darkness again, into old age, and then into death, and then into rebirth. And so these are the cycles that we're following. Now, I want to say something about dates. Because of colonialism, Christianity, a bunch of other stuff, whatever, we now often associate Samhain with the date of Halloween and that 3-date time, November 31st, November 2nd. The ancient Celts thought that the start of the day actually happened at night. So in the dark, again, we're in the dark, we're in the dark. The day starts in the dark, not when the sun rises. And also, we are an agricultural society and we're also moving with the moon phases, right? And so while most people celebrate Samhain on the 31st or the 1st or the 2nd or whatever, I think it's more apt to start it this season with the new moon, which means that would have been yesterday or today, as I check really quickly. And then the full moon, I think, is like November 4th. And so I invite you into this portal with the moon. And so to me, I'm already in Samhain. I'm there already. I'm in a portal of transformation. And you'll notice that the new moon is right at the same time that like Scorpio season happens typically. You know, if anyone is really good at astrology, I'm sure you've seen the conversations around how like what you thought your sign was when you were younger is no longer your sign. And that's all based on like planetary movements. We've got these like hard dates between this date and this date is Scorpio season. When really it's between this moon phase and that moon phase, right? So that's a whole other thing. But we begin in the dark, we end in the dark. And in between we grow and we grow old. We begin at night and we begin in the dark moon or the new moon. And we grow and grow and grow. And so I invite you to think about the seeds that we're planting. Now, in other parts of the world, the new year can be and is very different. I'm thinking of, ancient Egypt. The Nile River was the most important thing. And when the Nile would flood, this agricultural society that was dependent upon these waters, that's July. I think the Lunar New Year, the Chinese New Year, is February. That's like Imbolc time, right? When you look at these societies that have New Year dates in all these different places, I would encourage you to look at what's going on in those societies during that time. What is the land doing? What are the people, what do they hold sacred? What is important for their communities, for their survival? Now, that brings me to why modern witches in the West celebrate Samhain as the witches' New Year. Well, when New Age forms of paganism started to gain popularity in the West, there was a big focus on tracing lineage and relying on history, myth, folklore, and traditions from parts of the world that still honored the natural cycles. So Ireland and her festivals feature prominently in contemporary paganism for that reason. So Samhain found its way into the Wheel of the Year and is consequently celebrated by modern witches. So David Cheel and Jane Leverick tell us that Samhain symbolizes both death and rebirth. This time, if I have not stressed it enough, is significant as it represents a transition where the cycle of life comes to a close, paving the way for new beginnings, right? So the main transformation associated with Samhain is the acknowledgement of the end of the harvest and the onset of winter, reflecting the natural changes in the environment and the life cycles of plants and animals. It is a time for reflection and honoring the past, as well as preparing for the future. So how do we do that? I will tell you. There are many ways to honor your ancestors, sweep out the old, make space for the new, and set seeds of intention during this time. So if you're crafty, I encourage you to make a broom. If you're not crafty, grab a broom and really sweep out the place. I've seen a lot of conversation, I think I've said this before, where we're doing a lot of thinking about witchcraft and we're not doing enough crafting. in our witchcraft. And I don't mean like physical arts and crafts, unless that's your thing. I love to craft. But I mean like doing the thing that you're thinking about, right? Witchcraft is a practice. You've got to do something. And so pick up your broom and sweep out your space. And as you're doing it, envision all of the things that you no longer want to hold on to you, leaving your life, leaving your space. Any negative energy, any stagnant or stale energy, sweep it out so that you can make space, right? Another thing I would encourage you to do is have a silent supper. Have a silent supper. You can have one by yourself, or you can have a lot of fun and invite all of your witchy friends. And a silent supper is a way to honor your ancestors and honor the dead and invite them to have a meal with you. Now, we have silent suppers because we don't want to scare away the spirits with our loud talking and our voices, but also it is a sacred ceremony. It is a feast, yes, but it's also a sacred ceremony, right? And so we are setting the stage and setting the scene to invite our ancestors into this portal. And if we listen carefully in the silence, we may hear them speak to us or receive their wisdom. 3, create a spell to honor the dead, right? Actually practice your spellcraft during this time. And if you don't feel very confident about your spellcraft, about writing spells, do some divination first. This is a great time of year to practice your divination skills. Use the surface of a bowl of water. Use the flame. Use the smoke from the flame. Use your tarot cards. Do whatever it is that you do to divine, and ask for help. Ask for some guidance and assistance. And most importantly, make an ancestor altar. Decorate your altar with photos of your loved ones, objects that represent them. Maybe you want to leave some food or drink offerings, or you want to bring in some natural elements from the season. Do that. That's a really important thing to do. And in all of this, I want you to think a little more expansively about who your ancestors are. They're not just the people in your lineage. They could be the people in your profession. They could be the people in your community that have paved the way for you to be who you are. They could be animal or spirit helpers. They could be plants. They could be fruits and vegetables. They could be anything. Because we are all interconnected, and to assume that our only ancestors that have had an impact on us are the ones in our own family line, I think is a really big mistake. I feel very strongly that the wolf is an ancestor of mine. I also feel very strongly about like lizards and amphibians and things like that. I always have. Couldn't tell you why. I think the fire is an ancestor. The ocean is certainly an ancestor. You know, what do you feel pulled to? Honor them during this time. Because if there's any time where they're going to hear you and feel you, it's now. So, Happy New Year, witches. And I hope it is one that is full of blessings for you and all of the people who you love. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what you plan to do to celebrate the new year. Bye.